As the war passed into its fourth year in early September 942, Adolf Hitler, the German Führer, Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces and Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, was totally absorbed in his second summer campaign against the Soviet Union. For the last month and a half he had directed operations on the southern flank of the German Eastern Front from a Führer headquarters, the /Verwolf, CT Lip in a small forest half a dozen miles northeast of Vinnit in the Ukraine. With him, in the closely guarded headquarters community he rarely left, one of Plakacentov laid out prefabs and concrete structures, he had his personal staff, through which he exercised the political executive authority in Germany and the occupied territories, the Chief of the Armed Fork 5 High P. H Command, Obmkom 1 LL Duda. LV Hermokel, OKW. Generalfeld Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and a field detachment of the Armed Forces Operations Staff T4/MNCHL/NE/MSTAB WFST, under its chief, Generaloberst Alfred Jody. In Vinnitsa, a hot, dusty Provençal Tal, the Arnu High Command, Oberkom and Duda ILEAs, OKH, had established its headquarters under the Chief of Staff, OKH, Generaloberst Franz Halder. Through it Hitler commanded the army groups and armies in the Soviet Union. During the summer German Army GRO PSA and B had made spectacular advances to the Volga at Stalingrad and into the Western Caucasus. In August mountain troops had planted the German LAAG at the top of Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the Caucasus. But before the month ended, the offensive had begun to show signs of becoming engulfed in the vast arid expanses of southern USSR without attaining any of its strategic objectives, namely, the final Soviet defeat, the capture of the Caucasus and Caspian oil fields, and the opening of a route of deboulement across the Caucasus into the Middle East. Hitler had become peevish, depressed. At the situation conferences, his specific objections to how the offensive was being conducted almost invariably led on to angry questioning of the ability of the generals and their understanding of the fundamentals of military operations, On the afternoon of September 9th, after it particularly ituperative outburst the day before against Generalfeld Marschall Wilhelm List, whom he had repeatedly accused the past weeks of not following orders and of not properly deploying his troops, Hitler sent Keitel to Vinnitsa to tell Halder that Lee should submit his resignation as commanding general, Army Group A. Hitler intended to take command of the Army Group in person. To Halder, Keitel hinted that changes in other high posts were in the offing, including Halder's own. In fact, Hitler had already decided to dismiss Halder, who, he claimed, was no longer equal to the psychic demands of his position. He also considered getting rid of his closest military advisor, Jody, who had made the mistake of supporting List. Germany in August 1942 was at the peak of its World War II military expansion. It held Europe from the Pyrenees to the Caucasus, from Crete to the North Cape, and Panzer Army Africa HADPU shed into Egypt. During the summer's fighting in Solheim USSR mistakes, for which Hitler was trying to give the generals all the blame, had been Makelk, but these mistakes alone were not enough to account for the massive frustration that was being FCLT. IL was rooted in a more fundamental miscalculation. In the Dirkti /C for Tichy 142 offensive Hitler had established as the paramount objective, the final destruction of the Soviet Union's remaining human defensive strength. 6. He had assumed that the Soviet Union would sacrifice CC manpower CRVCS to defend the oil fields, and losing both would be brought to its knees. That had not happened. In late August the Eastern Intelligence Branch, OKH, had undertaken to assess the Soviet situation as it would exist at the close of the German Offen IUE. It had concluded that Lee's Soviet object THC were LO limit the loss of territory A much 1 GOS IBL during the summer, at the same time preserving enough manpower and material to stage a second winter offensive. It had assumed that the Soviet command had resigned itself before the start of the German offensive to losing the North Caucasus and Stalingrad, possibly also Leningrad and Moscow, and that consequently the territorial losses sustained, though severe, had not been unexpectedly so. Moreover, the Soviet casualties had fallen considerably below what might have been anticipated on the basis of the German 94 offensive. In sum, the Eastern Intelligence Branch had judged that the Soviet losses were on an order leaving combat-worthy forces available for the future, and that the German losses were not insignificant. On September 24, 942 General der Infanterie Kurt Zeitziger replaced Halder as Chief of Staff, OKH. In his farewell remarks to Halder, delivered in private after that day's situation conference, Hitler said that Halder's nerves were worn out and that his own Weicker no longer fresh, therefore they ought to part. He added that it was now necessary to educate the General Staff in fanatical faith in the idea, and that he was determined to enforce his will also on the army, implying thereby, and BV his lights no doubt with some justification, that under Halder's stewardship the army had clung too stubbornly to the HRCDS of its independence from politics and to its traditional command principles. As Zeitzler's appointment surprised everyone, including himself. He was a competent, but not supremely outstanding, staff officer. As Chief of Staff, Army Group D, defending the Low Countries and the Channel Coast, his energy and his rotund figure had earned him the nickname "U General Fireball." In one of the long evening monologues that have been recorded as table talk, Hitler, in June 1942, had remarked that Holland would be a tough nut for the enemy because Zeitzler buzzes back and forth there like a hornet and so prevents the troops from falling asleep from lack of contact with the enemy. Apparently, Hitler had decided that he preferred a high level of physical activity in the Chief of Staff to the, as he saw it, barren intellectualism of Halder and his like among the generals. The dismissal of Halder and Zeitzler's appointment as Chief of Staff, OKH, marked another stage in an enforced evolution that Hitler had imposed on the German command structure since early I9JL8. At that time, also to an accompaniment of dismissals in the highest ranks, he had abolished the War Ministry and personally assumed the title and functions of Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces. To take care of routine affairs and to provide himself with a personal staff as Commander-in-Chief, he had created the Armed Forces High Command and placed Keitel at its head with the title Chief, OKV. As the country moved toward and into the war, one The Armed Forces Operations Staff, one of the sections within the OKW, under its capable chief, Jody, would assume staff and planning functions paralleling and often competing with those of the service staffs. Seeking a more pliant top leadership in the Army High Command, Hitler had at the same time appointed Jenner Alleburst, later Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief, Army, and Halder, Chief of Staff, OKH. As Chief of Staff, OKH, Halder also headed the most exclusive and influential group within the Army, the Army General Staff. Very early in the war, Hitler had revealed that he was going to take an active part in directing military operations. His formal instrument for exercising control was the Führer Directive, which laid down the Strateg, and set objectives for a given operation or a major part of a continuing operation. At least in the early years, it usually embodied the thinking of the staffs as approved or amended BV Hitler. The Führer directives were issued through the Operations Staff, OKW, which gave that organization a voice in all crucial, high-level ECIOS even though it did not bear direct Ornmand responsibility. The invasion of Norway and Denmark in April J040 had introduced new planning and command procedures and had set precedents that Weicker to be followed on a larger scale in the future. The Operations Staff, OK/Unkler Hitler, had THN assumed direct planning and operational control, and the service commands had only supplied troops, equipment, and support. That change in the long run affected the arms most because land operations could be more easily parceled out among the commands, and because neither Hitler nor Jody and THE Operations Staff, OKW, were competent to handle the technical aspects of air or naval operations and were therefore inclined to leave them to the appropriate service staffs. By the summer of J94J, the OKW commanded usually through theater commanders in Norway, the Est, France and the Low Countries, the Balkans, and North Africa. The OKH bore command responsibility for the Eastern Front, USSR, only and not for the forces in northern Finland or for liaison with the Finnish army, both of the latter being included within the OKW's Northern Theater. By the time the campaign against the Soviet Union came under consideration in the late summer of 1Q40, Hitler and the German army had 3 brilliant victories behind them: Poland, Norway and Denmark, and France. The German army appeared in Sibk, and even to the skeptics Hitler had begun to look like an authentic military genius. In that atmosphere there probably was more fundamental unanimity in the upper caches of the German command than at any other turn, either before or later. The main problems associated with an operation in the Soviet Union appeared to be geographical, and they were obvious, if not necessarily simple, of solution. One such was the climate, which was markedly continental with short, hot summers, long, extremely cold winters, and an astonishing uniformity from north to south, considering THC country's great expanse. The climate, unless THC Germans wanted to risk a long, drawn-out war or a winter campaign for which the Wehrmacht was not trained or equipped, imposed on them a requirement for finishing off the Soviet Union in a SI-Engel summer offensive of not more than 5 months' duration. Consequently, in the Cry earliest planning stage, at the end of July 40, Hitler had put off the invasion until the following summer. The Ras/Jayetlils, literally, traffic stoppages, brought on high the spring thaw and the fall rains, which turned the Soviet roads into impassable quagmires for periods of several weeks, imposed additional limitations on the Timl-Ilg. The paramount problem was the one which had also confronted earlier invaders: how to accomplish a military victory in the /Astings of the Rus. Ian Spack. Apart from Lee Pripyat Mahis and Evril of the large Rivkers, the terrain in European USSR did not offer notable impediments to the movement of modern military forces. But maintaining concentration of forces and supplying armies in the depths of the country presented staggering, potentially C/N crippling, Cliff T. Kultais. The whole of the Soviet Union had only 000 miles of railroads, all broader gauge than those in German and Eastern Europe. Of the critical 8,000 miles of roads, 700,000 were no more than cart tracks. 1,000 mile were allegedly all-weather roads, but only 40,000 miles of those were hard surf-aced. 13 Hitler and the generals agreed that the Olution Whack to trap and destroy the main Soviet forces in Kar the Fromin. RN December JQ40, Hauk CR. When THC strategic plan was being cast into the form of a Führer directive, the generals disagreed with Hitler on how to go from that to the next stage, the final Soviet defeat. Halder and Brauchitsch proposed to concentrate on the Anek toward Moscow. In that direction the roads were the best, and they believed the Soviet Union could be forced to commit its last strength to defend the capital, which was also the most important industrial complex and hub of the country's road and railroad networks. Hitler, however, was not convinced that the war could be decided at Moscow, and he had his way. Führer Directive 2I for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, when it was issued on December 8, 1940, provided for simultaneous advances toward Leningrad, /1 Osko, and Kiev, and for a possible halt and diversion of forces from the Moscow thrust to aid the advance toward Leningrad. For the moment, the difference of opinion on strategy cast only the slightest shadow on the prevailing mood of optimism. Staff studies showed that the Soviet Union would be defeated in 8 weeks, TCN weeks at most. 14 The Army Operation Order for Barbarossa was issued in early February 94 and the build-up on the eastern frontier began shortly thereafter, gradually at first. Map I. The OKH assigned 49 divisions, including 19 Panzer armored divisions, to the operation. The total strength was 3,050 men. Army of Norway was to deploy another 4 divisions, 67,000 troops, in northern Finland. The Finnish army eventually added another 500,000 MCN in 14 divisions and 3 brigades, and Romania furnished 14 infantry divisions and 3 brigades, all of them under strength, about 150,000 men. The Barbarossa force initially had 3,350 tanks, 7 I-84 artillery pieces, 600,000 motor vehicles, and 62,500 horses. The most significant assets of the German army on the eve of the Russian campaign were its skill and experience in conducting mobile warfare. The Panzer Corps, employed with great success in the French campaign of 940, had been succeeded by a larger mobile unit, the Panzer Group. 4 of these WERC to spearhead the advance into the Soviet Union. The Panzer Groups were in fact powerful armored armies, but until LAT 1941, conservatism among some senior generals prevented them from getting the status of full-fledged armies. 7 conventional armies and 4 panzer groups were assigned to 3 army groups, each responsible for operations in one of the main strategic directions. Army Group North, commanded by General Feld-Marschall Wilhelm von Lesseb, was to attack out of East Prussia, through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under General Feld-Marschall Fedor von Bock, assembled on the frontier east of Warsaw for a thrust via Minsk and Smolensk toward Moscow. Army Group South, General Feld-Marschall Gerd von Rundstedt commanding, was responsible for the sector between the Pripyat marshes and the Black Sea and was to attack toward Kiev and the line of the Dnieper River. The Finnish army, operating independently under its own commander-in-chief, Marshal Karl Mannerheim, was to attack south on both sides of Lake Ladoga to increase the pressure on the Soviet forces defending Leningrad and so facilitate Army Group North's advance. The German Air Force High Command, Oberkommando det Luftwaffe, OKL, assigned to Barbarossa OMC 2,770 aircraft out of a total Air Force first-line strength of 4,300. Planes for the INVA, Ion of the Soviet Union were nearly 700 fewer than the number used in the much smaller French campaign, and the Air Force was, in the first 5 months of 94 foot, almost totally committed against Great Britain and would have to continue so on a reduced scale after Barbarossa began. Because of the strain the fighting in 2 widely separated theaters would impose on his resources and organization, the Commander-in-Chief, Air Force, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, had strongly opposed the operation against the Soviet Union. The campaign in the Balkans in the spring of '94 added a further complication, as it also did for some of the ground forces. Because of the danger of giving the operation away by a sudden drop in the intensity of the attacks against Great Britain, the flying units could not be shifted cast until the latest possible moment and then only after an elaborate radio deception had been arranged to give the impression that they were being redeployed for an invasion of England. In spite of that and the other problems, however, the German Air Force looked forward to the campaign with confidence. It had the advantage of first-rate equipment, combat experience, and SUP-E. The air units deployed on the eastern frontier, between the Baltic and the Black Sea, were organized as 1st Air Force, supporting Army Group North, 2nd Air Force, supporting Army Group Center, and 4th Air Force, supporting Army Group South. IG 5th Air Force, its main mission, the air defense of Norway, was to give modest support to the Army of Norway and Finnish army forces operating out of Finland. In accordance with standard German practice, the relationship between the air forces and the army groups was strictly limited to cooperation and coordination. The German Navy's first concern in Barbaros SA was to be maintaining control of the Baltic Sea. It had additional limited missions in the Arctic Ocean and the Black Sea, both of which the Navy High Command, Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, OKM, believed could not be executed until after the air and land operations had eliminated the Soviet naval superiority. 17 The Navy was also heavily engaged in operations against Great Britain, and the Commander-in-Chief Navy, Gross Admiral Erich Raeder, like Göring, would rather have avoided further commitments. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the military and political centers of gravity in Germany moved from Berlin to the forests of East Prussia. There, beside the railroad running cast from Rassenburg, an elaborate Führer headquarters, the WFNZ, Wolf's Lair, of painstakingly camouflaged concrete bunkers protected by rings of steel fences, palisades, and earthworks, had been constructed. In one closely guarded compound Hitler lived and worked with his intimate military and political advisors. Another a short distance away housed the operations staff, OKW, and the communications center. The OKH was located just outside Rassenburg, a half-hour away by rail. The railroad was closed to all traffic cast of Rassenburg except that between the OKH headquarters and the /Wolf SSC Hands, and the courier trains that shuttled back and forth to Berlin. From the outset, Hitler demonstrated that he did not mean to let the conduct of operations rest entirely in the hands of the professionals. During the first weeks, his interference took the form mostly of nervous meddling and random attempts to impose on the battlefield tactical conceptions that occurred to him in his remote position. Halder, possibly with more trenchant insight than he realized, characterized Hitler's behavior as symptomatic of a lack of confidence in the execute commands and a failure to grasp the essential feature of the German command system: its reliance on training in a common body of doctrine to make each command level capable of performing its functions with a minimum of interference from above. Unfortunately for the German army, Brauchitsch was no longer, if indeed he ever had been, the man to defend this principle. Conscious that he was both used and despised by Hitler, he vacillated futilely between complete subservience to the Führer and the urgings of his professional conscience, and most often ended by trying to suppress the latter with the excuse that he could not oppose his commander-in-chief. In the field, the invasion forged ahead more rapidly even than the staff and command post exercises had forecast. Before the end of the second week, it appeared that the first phase objective, destruction of the Soviet Army main force close to the western frontier, had been accomplished. In twin pockets at Białystok and Minsk, Army Group Center estimated that it had taken over 3,000 prisoners. After a comparatively slow start by Army Group South, all three German army groups were advancing at high speed. By mid-July, Army Groups North and Center reached and crossed the Dwina and Dnieper rivers, the easternmost lines on which, according to German calculations, the Russians could defend their chief industrial areas. Army Group Center was completing another vast encirclement near Smolensk, and Army Group South had begun a gigantic enveloping operation in the Ukraine west of the Dnieper. Halder even looked forward hope, only to the time when the front would become so fluid that the battles would outrun Hitler's capability as a tactician. That was not going to happen. In fact, Hitler had arrived at the stage where he was prepared to free himself entirely from professional tutelage. On July 19, 1941, he completed a directive about which the OKH had not been consulted at all and which, although it was initialed by Jody and Keitel, apparently did not reflect any significant consultation with the operations staff, OKW. In it, Hitler reaffirmed his conviction that Moscow was not the primary strategic objective. He directed that in the next phase Army Group Center, the strongest of the three army groups in the Soviet Union, was to continue toward Moscow with its infantry alone and was to divert its armor to help Army Group North toward Leningrad and Army Group South in the conquest of the Ukraine. In effect, the advance on Moscow was to be stopped. He had revealed that intention in the original Barbarossa directive, but the generals had assumed that the logic of events, particularly after the invasion began, the indications that the Russians were massing their main forces in front of Moscow, would force him to change his mind. In the ensuing month, Halder and Brauchitsch marshaled all the arguments they could and enlisted backing from Jody and two of the Army Group commanders to help oppose the strategic change. Hitler from time to time showed signs of attempting to form a decision based on the realities of the Ituaton and at one point revised Hybe directive. But in the directive as issued on 2 August, he stated, "The proposals of the OKH for the continuance of the operation in the East do not conform with my intentions," and ordered that Moscow was not to be considered the principal objective but was to be ranked after the Crimea and the Ukrainian coalfields in the south and Leningrad in the north. Two small incidents revealed how far the OKH had lost ground. Hitler, also on August 21, accused Brauchitsch of having failed all along to conduct the offensive on the lines he, the Führer, desired. 3 days later, Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, who would have to execute the maneuver and who claimed that turning the armor south from Army Group Center was impossible, was called in to make a last-ditch attempt to dissuade Hitler. In the Führer's presence, he reversed himself completely, later lamely explained that confronted with the Führer's resolve, he had had Leto make the impossible possible. 21 By September 6, Hitler, concluding that the army groups on the flanks had been helped enough, decided to renew the Army Group Center advance toward Moscow. Army Group North in the meantime had closed up to Leningrad on The south, but had yet to complete the encirclement on the east by joining hands with the Finns. Hitler had decided literally to starve the city out of existence. Army Group South, reinforced by Guderian's tanks, was completing an enormous encirclement east of Kiev but still had long distances to go to take the Donetsk Basin and the Crimea. Hitler ordered both army groups to complete the operations with their own resources and return the units they had received from Army Group Center. Army Group Center jumped off on October 2nd and within a week had broken open the Soviet front west of Moscow and formed two massive encirclements. The victory then appeared so near that the OKW cancelled the expeditions out of northern Finland aimed at cutting the Murmansk Railroad, the supply line for outside aid to the Soviet Union. Then, at the end of the first week in October, in the Army Group Center and Army Group North areas, it began to rain. Relentlessly, through the rest of the month and into early November, rain, snow, and alternate freezing and thawing turned the roads into oozing ribbons of mud. Between the 2nd and the 10th of October, Army Group Center's armies gained 30 miles a day. In the next 20 days their advance fell off to 2 to 5 miles a day. In the first 2 weeks of November they remained practically at a standstill on the line Kalinin-Tula, 54 miles west of Moscow. In mid-November, after several cold, bright days, Army Group Center began to roll again. From the first it was apparent that the Army Group was not the fighting machine it had been. After 5 months' combat the troops were tired, and, if not discouraged, the troops and command both were becoming uneasy over the offensive that dragged on without a satisfactory end in sight. The equipment was showing wear and supplies and parts now had to come over long and unreliable lines. Losses in the campaign were approaching 750,000, no more than half of them replaced. Infantry companies were down to 25 and 30% of authorized strengths. First lieutenants were commanding battalions. 24 At the beginning of the fourth week of the month Army Group Center had put its every man and weapon into the attack. The best hope was that the Russians had done the same. That they had not began to become apparent at the end of the month when Soviet forces launched heavy counterattacks against Army Group South that forced the Germans to give up Rostov / the gateway to the Caucasus. On December 5th Army Group Center, which had a spearhead on the north within sight of Moscow, reported that it was at the end of its strength. It could go no farther. The month of December 1941 ended the 3-1 years string of German victories with a jolt that shook the German army to its boot soles. Hardest hit in the long run was the Army Command. Brauchitsch, who had had a heart attack in November, decided in early December to ask for retirement. By then he had been reduced to nothing more than a messenger boy. On important matters Hitler communicated directly with the army groups. On December 19 Hitler assumed the post of Commander-in-Chief, OKH, himself, and thereby wiped out the army's last vestige of service independence. Ignoring his advisors, Hitler ordered the next morning, in snow and fog and 40 below zero temperature, the Russians counter-attacked. The month of December 1941 ended the 3-1 years string of German victories with a jolt that shook the German army to its boot soles. Hardest hit in the long run was the Army Command. Brauchitsch, who had had a heart attack in November, decided in early December to ask for retirement. By then he had been reduced to nothing more than a messenger boy. On important matters Hitler communicated directly with the army groups. On December 19 Hitler assumed the post of Commander-in-Chief, OKH, himself, and thereby wiped out the army's last vestige of service independence. Ignoring his advisors, Hitler ordered the field commands to stand fast and called for fanatical resistance by the troops. In fact, they had no other choice. No positions existed in the rear, and none could be built in ground frozen so hard that impacting heavy artillery shells chipped out craters only inches deep. No one had given thought to fighting in the Russian winter. Weapons not conditioned for severe cold jammed, and lack of winter clothing, antifreeze, and low-temperature lubricants immobilized both men and vehicles. Commanders who lacked the stamina or the stomach for fanatical resistance as Hitler conceived it were removed. Von Rundstedt, the senior field marshal, had been dismissed as commanding general, Army Group South, in Hitler's first peek over the retreat from Rostov. In mid-December, von Bock relinquished command of Army Group Center, pleading illness. Later, von Lepp, whose Army Group North had been stopped and turned back at Tikhvin in an attempt to join hands with the Finns and then was caught up in the Soviet counteroffensive, asked to be relieved. Making examples of generals who ordered retreats, Hitler dismissed Guderian and Generaloberst Erich Heppner and deprived the latter of his rank and privileges, including the right to wear the uniform. Hitler's determination and repeated appeals to the troops for fanatical resistance were not enough to prevent the expanding Soviet offensive from chopping deep into the front at numerous places in the Army Group Center and Army Group North sectors. At the turn of the year, a breakthrough on the Army Group Center north flank and a deepening dent on its south flank brought the Germans to the astonished, horrified realization that the Russians were trying nothing than to encircle the whole Army Group Center. On January 15, 1942, Hitler for the first time in the war ordered a major withdrawal. He authorized Army Group Center to take its front opposite Moscow back to a north-south line 85 miles west of the capital. That was not enough to escape the threatening encirclement. It only shortened the Army Group Center front somewhat and thus freed some troops for the flanks. The orders to stand and fight remained in full effect. From mid-January until well into February, the crisis at the front deepened. Although Army Group Center regained some control on its south flank, it was for weeks nearly helpless against the thrust on the north and barely managed to keep open its lifeline, the road and railroad running east from Smolensk. Astride the Army Group North, Army Group Center boundary of the front was torn open on a 16-mile stretch between Rzhev and Lake Lyman. At Demyansk, south of the lake, 2 German corps, 100,000 men, were completely encircled and had to be supplied by air. Decision not to PC. MIT. A general retreat, some suggest, was made less on military grounds than out of a desperate necessity to protect his image as an infallible leader. Nevertheless, even his harshest critics later had to concede that the German armies, caught as they were without prepared positions to fall back on or even adequate winter equipment and clothing, might well have disintegrated if the command had conceded a necessity to retreat. 29 Hitler not only did not lose but probably gained stature in the eyes of, at least, the rank and file. His confidence in his own military judgment was strengthened. This at a time when the terms on which the war was being fought were undergoing a drastic alteration. As a consequence, the German conduct of the rest of the war was dominated by a conflict between the Militar Professional's principles, flexibility and mobility, and Hitler's rigidity, between command initiative and blind execution of the Führer's will. On March 15, 1942, Hitler delivered a Memory all Day Ildenstenklag address in Berlin. He promised that Bolshevism would be destroyed in the coming summer and that the Bolshevik colossus would not thereafter again touch the sacred soil of Europe. Privately, he and his confidants did not look to the future with assurance quite that strong. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and Göring had nagging qualms, chiefly on the score of Soviet capabilities. Hitler talked to Goebbels about the coming campaign and declared that he intended only to take the Caucasus, Leningrad, and Moscow, one after the other and not simultaneously. He was determined, whatever the circumstances, he said, to go into winter quarters in time. He blamed Brauchitsch, whom he described as a nincompoop and a coward, for overextending in 1941. 31 On April 26 Hitler undertook to present an accounting to the Reichstag, grandly. He aimed that in the days of crisis during the winter, he had felt compelled to place his own person at the forefront in meeting whatever fate had in store. He thanked the soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers up to those generals who, recognizing the danger, risked their own lives to urge the soldiers onward. The only author reference to the generals was that in a few individual cases, where nerves gave way, discipline broke down or insufficient sense of duty was displayed, he had found it necessary to intervene severely. He asked and was automatically granted sweeping authority to dismiss or demote any civil servant or officer as it suited him. That in effect swept away the remnants of administrative independence in the German government and the armed forces. Ominous as the strengthening of the dictatorship was, however, it attracted less attention than the almost offhand remark, "Next winter, no matter where it finds us, will find us better prepared." 32 The directive for the 1942 summer campaign, Operation BLAU, provided for a full-scale offensive only on the south flank of the Eastern Front, toward the Don River, Stalingrad, and the Caucasus oil fields. Map 2. Hitler was in complete command. Halder and his staff assistants had drafted the directive in accordance with Hitler's detailed instructions, and Hitler had then dictated the final version, revising and expanding as he went along. The advance into the Caucasus had the characteristics of an expedition, albeit a massive one. In fact, it had been regarded as such when it was first considered in the late fall of 1941. In the directive for BLAU, Hitler elevated it to the level of a strategic, decision-seeking offensive, one it was to be executed in 2 stages. First, several successive enveloping thrusts, beginning on the north along the Kursk-Voronezh axis, were to smash the Soviet south flank and carry the front out to the Don River. After that, the advance would proceed to Stalingrad and across the lower Don into the Caucasus. For the operation, Army Group South was to be split to form 2 army groups designated as A and B. Army Group B, to be under von Bock, who now found himself well enough to command, would open the attack on the north. Army Group A, under List, would start somewhat later and be primarily responsible for the thrust across the lower Don and into the Caucasus. In the regroupment, Army Group B took command of 2nd, 4th Panzer, and 6th Armies, the first 2 detached from Army Group Center. Army Group A was assigned 1st Panzer, 11th, and 17th Armies. For the first time in the East, the German allies, Italy, Hungary, and Romania, took to the field in earnest, each providing an army. All 3 of the Allied armies were deficient in equipment and training, and the Romanians and Hungarians would much rather have fought each other than the Russians. But then, the Allied armies were expected only to lend substance to Hitler's claim that he was conducting a selfless crusade against Bolshevism, and occasionally to provide cover on the German Phalanx. Hitler's decision to limit the 194-2 campaign was not a free choice. After the strains and drains of the 1941 offensive and the winter battles just ended, even Operation BLAU as planned bore discernible marks of austerity. Of the least to 67 divisions that were to participate in the offensive/E, full 2/3 had to be rebuilt and rehabilitated while committed at the front, and only 1/3 were new or rebuilt behind the front. As of May 1, 1942, the infantry divisions were at 0% of their authorized strengths. They were brought up to 100% by the time the offensive started, but, as a consequence, the divisions of Army Group Center and North would not attain more than 55% of authorized strengths before August 1942. The panzer divisions in the offensive would have 3 tank battalions apiece, but those of the other army groups only 1. The spearhead divisions in BLAU would have 85% of their organic motor vehicle allowances, but the other divisions would have far less. Artillery, anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons could be brought to authorized levels for the units in the offensive, in some instances only by reaching into stocks of captured equipment, but an ammunition drought had set in during the winter and was expected to continue through the autumn of 1942. Only in the air did the German strength fully equal that of the 94-foot campaign. During the winter, the transfer of 2nd Air Force to the Mediterranean to participate in the attempted reduction of Malta and to support operations in North Africa had reduced air strength on the Eastern Front to 700 planes. The necessity for flying supply missions to numerous cut-off and encircled forces had further reduced the flying unit's combat effectiveness. In the spring, in anticipation of the summer offensive, the air strength in the east had been raised to a total of 2,750 aircraft. 4th Air Force on the southern sector of the front received by far the largest share, 1,500 planks. At dawn on June 28, 2nd Army and 4th Panzer Army opened the offensive. They smashed through the Soviet front east of Kursk and pushed Kast toward Voronezh, reaching the outskirts of the city in 4 days and taking it on July 6. 4th Panzer Army then turned southeast along the Don to meet 6th Army. WHICH had moved out east of Kharkov on June. The German armies again held the upper hand, but the first 2 thrusts, to Voronezh and Kast of Kharkov, which had been planned as great encirclements on the 1-4I pattern, brought in less than 100,000 prisoners. Disappointed, Hitler on July replaced von Bock as commanding general, Army Group B, with Generalfeldmarschall Maximilian von Weizsäcker. Hitler had originally intended to execute a third encirclement inside the D on Bend at dawn on June 28. 2nd Army and 4th Panzer Army opened the offensive. They smashed through the Soviet front east of Kursk and pushed Kast toward Voronezh, reaching the outskirts of the city in 4 days and taking it on July 6. 4th Panzer Army then turned southeast along the Don to meet 6th Army. WHICH had moved out east of Kharkov on June. The German armies again held the upper hand, but the first two thrusts, to Voronezh and Kast of Kharkov, which had been planned as great encirclements on the 1-4I pattern, brought in less than 100,000 prisoners. Disappointed, Hitler on July replaced von Bock as commanding general, Army Group B, with Generalfeldmarschall Maximilian von Weizsäcker. Hitler had originally intended to execute a third encirclement inside the D on Bend at 1800 turn and advance on the city from the south. Through August and September, the offensive continued without attaining any of the major objectives. Army Group A took Maykop but found the oil fields destroyed. 2 Panzer Corps headed for Krasny but were slowed and finally stopped for several weeks by gasoline shortages. The trucks making the long trip from Rostov were burning nearly as much gasoline as they could haul. Spearheads pushed into the Caucasus, but the Russians continued to hold all the passes. 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army closed in on Stalingrad from Lee west and south, but had to spread their forces thin to cover their flanks and so lost momentum. On September 8, 1942, the organizational branch, OKH, reported, "All planning must take into account the unalterable fact that the predicted strength of the Army field forces as of November 1, 1942 will be 800,000, or 18%. Below established strength are approximately 3,200,000 land that it is no longer possible to reduce those numbers." IT had already predicted that the best to be expected was that the available manpower reserves would cover the next winter's losses and prevent a further decline before the spring of 194-3. False impressions will result, the report continued, if units continue to be carried as before with this great loss of strength. The organizational branch proposed reducing better than half the divisions on the Eastern Front from 3 regiments to 2. 37. The larger and far more difficult problem was finding actual relief from the manpower squeeze. Since May 1942, General Clef Infantkrieg Walter von Unruh, armed with the authority to order irrevocable transfers to the Eastern Front, had been combing the rear areas as Hitler's personal representative. Unruh, whose visits generally met with dismay if not terror and who earned the nickname General Kuldklau, Hero SN Achur, had succeeded in paring down some of the rear echelon staffs, but after 3 or 4 months it had become apparent that the results, though worthwhile, would not be decisive. The organizational branch, OKH, in the fall of 42 proposed to release some men from the rear echelons by Lee in Hilfswillage, Army auxiliaries, recruited among the Rus-ian prisoners of war are to take over service and supple Y jobs behind the Lin ES and thought it might gain another 80,000 to 90,000 by tightening the tables of organization. A potential source of relief for the Army's manpower problem was the Air Force, which had a sizable surplus. In September 1942 Hitler agreed to tap at surplus, but at Göring's insistence decided not to use the men as Army replacements but to form Air Force field divisions manned and officered exclusively by Air Force personnel. In September and October Hitler ordered 20 such divisions created with a combined strength of about 200,000 men. From the Army point of view, a more unsatisfactory arrangement would have been difficult to devise. The Air Force troops had no training in land warfare and BKU, i.e. Göring restricted the Army's influence on them to the absolute minimum on ground that the attitudes of the Army would impa his troops National Socialist indoctrination were not likely to be given enough to make them anywhere near suitable for employment on the ARN front. Worse yet, the Army had to scrape together enough new equipment to outfit 20 divisions, and the diversion of vehicles alone forced postponement of PL to bring 4 or 5 VE Panzer divisions up to strength. 41 other promising palliative was the employment of larger numbers of heavy and automatic weapons. The operations branch, OKH, proposed to supply the frontline units with new and more efficient weapon, as they became available / withdrawing the older weapons and so wind-lip with both more and better firepoker. 11 German-wise newest and most promising weapon, however, the Tiger tank, was slow getting into production. Tests of 2 prototypes in July 1942 had revealed that the tanks would not be battle-worthy before the end of the Akar. A command shake-up Hitler could hardly have expected to solve or greatly mitigate any of his immediate problems by changing chiefs of staff in September 1942. The tighter personal hold he got on the command apparatus of the army by the shift from Halder to Zeitzler was also not very significant and took the form mainly of a symbolic downgrading of a very senior post by the appointment to it of a very junior general. Nevertheless, by the change, Hitler proposed more than merely to give vent to his personal animosity against Halder. That he had in view, probably motivated by even deeper-seated animosities, was nothing less than a recasting to his mind rejuvenation of the whole German officer corps, the general staff and general officer ranks in particular. To enable himself to do this, and to get close control of all officer appointments as well, he assumed personal supervision of the Heerespersonalarmee, Army Amser Personnel Office, and placed it under his chief adjutant, General Major Rudolf Schmundt. To Schmundt he outlined a policy of rapid promotion, particularly of younger, battle-tested Officer, to the highest ranks. Zeitzler, 40 CEN, old and a general officer less than a year at the time of his appointment, // quote, an example. He also proposed to break the general staff's hold on the higher appointments by training good line officers to qualify for advancement to the top positions and by requiring general staff officers to acquire experience as troop commanders. He talked about eventually abolishing the general staff's distinctive red trouser stripes and silver collar tabs. As chief of staff, OKH, Zeitzler quickly demonstrated that he did not intend to be merely a yes-man, and during his first days in the post, he secured a major victory in the intramural Cold War that was a part of the functioning of the German command. The army had long regarded as unfortunate, if not baneful, the influence of the operations staff, OKW, Jody on the drafting of Führer directives, many of which, although ostensibly strategic, were primarily concerned with tactical operations on the Eastern Front. The irritation had increased after Hitler became commander-in-chief, army, and thereby converted the army staff into a second personal staff. It had been sharpened by the freewheeling criticism Keitel and Jody had indulged in from their technically loftier positions on the command chain. Taking advantage of Jody's having fallen into disfavor, Zeitzler, immediately upon his appointment, demanded and secured the OKW's exclusion from the drafting of Führer directives applying Soloviev to the Eastern Front. Henceforth such directives were to be issued as operations orders through the OKH. He also succeeded in having the reporting proctor at the Dale Y situation conferences changed. Instead of Jody's reporting on Altnieters, the Chief of Staff, OKH, opened the conference with a report on the East and then Jody followed with a report on the other theaters. Subsequently, on the ground that the need to know no longer existed, Zeitzler managed, further, to cut off the OKW operations staff's access to detailed information concerning Eastern Front operations. In the long run, he achieved another effect in no way less important for its being inadvertent, namely, the hardening of the concept of OKH and OKW theaters that made the Eastern Front the OKH's exclusive and only operational concern and bred competition and rivalry with the OKW theaters, the West, the Balkans, Italy, and Northern Europe, where earnest coordination would doubtless have served the German cause better. On October 4, 194-inch Hitler issued Operations Order 1 in which he announced, this year's summer and fall campaign, excepting the operations underway and several local offensives still contemplated, has been convoluted. The order was purportedly aimed at initiating a shift to the defensive Kvork winter set in, its effect the opposite. Hitler ordered Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group B to get ready for winter in the lines THCY held. But 6th Army was to continue the attack at Stalingrad and Army Group A was to stand by for further orders, which meant that in the two sectors where German forces were still in motion he was going to continue the offensive. In Operations Order I and a supplement issued some days later, Hitler elevated to the level of doctrine the fanatical resistance formula he had employed during the Soviet 1941-42 winter offensive. He ordered that the winter positions were to be held under all circumstances, there would be no evasive maneuvers or withdrawals, breakthroughs were to be localized, and any intact part of the front was absolutely to be held. Cut off and encircled elements were to defend themselves where they stood until relieved.